Thank you for the invitation and the warm welcome, and for your presentation, Mohammed. I produced that video 4 years ago, so it's interesting to see it now, armed with the perspective I think I've picked up in the last few years, and I wouldn't differ from any of it. I think all of it's very important to keep in mind. I noticed a chuckle that went around the room when, in the good scenario, Ali shut the door behind him. But that actually is very important with respect to the boundaries of your Fourth Amendment rights. The only part that I guess I would want to introduce that might be a little bit troubling is that we did produce the video very much in response to the issues that were happening 4 years ago. And while if you do get a visit from the FBI and a voluntary interview, all of that guidance still applies, law enforcement and intelligence agencies have evolved their methods, and voluntary interviews by the FBI are not the only ways in which you might be watched by our government. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the different issues that have emerged since. I also want to acquaint you with some of the history that preceded all of this. And just to get a sense of, and I'm just going to go through one more. We've talked about the war on drugs, we've talked about the war on immigration, and now I want to zoom back from what you saw in the video to talk a little bit about what the war on terror has entailed in the last 10 years. FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, does that mean anything to folks in the room? Few? Okay. In 1974, after the Watergate era, after Congress conducted a 2-year investigation into COINTELPRO, I referenced it earlier, these were the counterintelligence programs. These are programs in which the FBI, the CIA, even the Defense Department were caught eventually infiltrating all kinds of domestic First Amendment protected groups. Not just the civil rights movement, not just the movement for Puerto Rican independence, not just the movement to end the war in Vietnam, not just the movement for equal rights for women, all of those movements, and then others. The most famous target of COINTELPRO was Dr. Martin Luther King. There's a federal holiday named after the man. The FBI tried to drive him to suicide, and that's not a conspiracy theory, it's documented. Congress, the US Senate, in 1976 described COINTELPRO, this is a quote, a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at suppressing the legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association. Congress compiled 20,000 pages in 2 years based on the testimony of hundreds of CIA, FBI, and DOD agents that basically turned on their superiors to rat out these abuses to the congressional committees. At the end of all this, in 1976, there was a law passed, FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It was supposed to stop COINTELPRO, as were the 1976 Attorney General's guidelines. A whole series of policies were put in place to try to keep our intelligence agencies from turning the lens onto the American people. All of those checks and balances have failed in the last 10 years. FISA was rewritten in 2008 to permit the National Security Agency, the NSA, what many of us in the Beltway colloquially describe as no such agency, to monitor every electronic communication sent anywhere in the world. Every email that is sent anywhere is captured by the NSA. Every phone call that includes an international source is captured and monitored by the NSA, and we know that there's more, but nobody knows what the limits are because it's all been hidden by secrecy. Congress doesn't know, the federal courts don't know, you and I don't know, most people at the NSA don't even know. That's just one wing of the war on terror. Before, I referenced the Secure Communities Initiative and the immigrant deportation regime. It's been used as a pretext to create a biometric data tracking system in which the FBI collects at least the fingerprints, soon the iris patterns, and even the voice modulation patterns of everyone who is booked for any criminal offense anywhere in the country. Remember, to be booked for a criminal offense, you don't have to be convicted of anything. You don't have to have done anything wrong. A police officer somewhere needs merely to think that there's probable cause to think you may have done something wrong. Or, for that matter, through any number of voluntary schemes, like, for instance, licensing exams, right? If you sit for the bar exam as a lawyer, you give your fingerprints. Where does that end up? In the biometric database. We are creating a system of national ID cards that don't even need cards because they use our bodies instead. The immigrant deportation regime has been used as a pretext to create that. It's called the Next Generation Initiative. If you're taking notes, write down NGI, the Next Generation Initiative. This is stuff, by the way, you'll never hear on the nightly news, right? Mainstream media doesn't report on this stuff, which I do want to, and I'll reiterate this again in a minute. Mohammed made the point of signing up for the email updates from Muslim advocates, from the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, other groups, maybe the Center for Constitutional Rights. You have to stay informed actively. That's the first step to rolling back these issues, is staying informed. You can't expect our institutions to do it for you. In schools, you won't generally learn this stuff. You won't learn it watching television, and you won't get it even reading the newspaper. You have to go find it. There are plenty of groups out there that are collecting this information for you. We do a newsletter once a month. I know Muslim Advocates does as well. We have a blog where we report on this stuff every day. But you have to actively avail yourself of that information to become an empowered change agent. So let me just step back. We talked about the war on drugs. We talked about the war on immigration. We talked about the war on terror. And we talked particularly about the NSA. We talked about NGI and the Next Generation Initiative. And we talked a little bit about the NYPD as an example of what local surveillance can look like. I want to now just get off the question of what is wrong and invite your attention to how to fix it. So just this very week, in the last week, there were 3 different city councils around the country, in Amherst, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California, very near here in Tacoma Park, Maryland, that passed local resolutions affirming fundamental rights eroded in the wars on drugs, immigration, and terror. In Tacoma Park, it was a resolution affirming the right to trial in the wake of the Defense Authorization Act. NDAA, it's another term. Is anybody familiar with the NDAA? Very few hands. I am glad we're having this conversation, but I really have to plead with you guys to read. You have to look for information. The NDAA, the reason I introduced FISA before and the NSA's program and the NGI and now the NDAA is to make the point that the abuses happening in the war on terror under President Obama are no better than those that happened under President Bush. And in fact, they've all gotten a good deal worse. The surveillance regime is worse now than it was in 2008. The NDAA was a law passed with the president's signature on December 31st, 2011. What kind of laws does the president sign on New Year's Eve? The kind that the government wants no one to see, right? It's a law that permits, it could permit, a future or this president to detain anyone without trial for the basis of offenses that are not even criminal. It's not the power to criminalize ethnicities like in the Japanese internment. It's not the power to oppress activist groups like the 24 Peace and Justice activists who continue to linger under an FBI investigation for speech crimes. It is the power to do all of these things without judicial checks. It is heinous. It is precisely the kind of law that the movement in Egypt cited last year as a basis for the Tahrir Square resistance. The military detention regime that just came online in the last year is dramatically worse than the Patriot Act. Everyone's heard of the Patriot Act, right? That was the beginning of this effort, but it wasn't the end. It's gotten many times worse since then. And you can see it in the different experiences that are aligned of African Americans, Latinos, Muslims, environmentalists, peace and justice activists, supporters of Ron Paul, and military service members, all of whom have been flagged as threats for domestic terrorism. So the next time you feel marginalized, remember that every service member who's gone to Iraq or Afghanistan and come home, they have the same badge of suspicion that you do. That might sound preposterous. It is preposterous, but think about what it implies. The fact that you are not alone gives you the opportunity to stand up and voice not just support for your rights, but support for the rights of all of the different communities that stand in the crosshairs. It is crucial that we stand for all of the communities that stand in the crosshairs, because alone we don't have the political influence to change the policies, but together we do. The central lesson of this country's history is that when people come together to non-violently champion common causes, things change. And as long as we run in different directions, nothing will happen. And the more and more we worry about the rights of Muslims, the more and more we will dig ourselves a pit. The constitutional crisis that afflicts the United States at the moment requires the restoration of constitutional rights for all Americans, and you each have the opportunity to be an advocate for that principle. The first step, again, is getting informed, learning about the issues, sign up for the newsletters, read the blogs, take a few minutes a day just to catch up on the news that you won't hear about from the television. The second step, and this is critical, is reaching out. It is not enough to stay within the four corners of our homes or our mosques. Every single one of us holds an obligation at this point in history to be ambassadors, to build bridges, meet people from the communities that suffer similar abuses, go to their meetings. Many of you do interfaith outreach where perhaps you go to a house of worship of another faith. Do that not just with the purpose of meeting people, not just with the purpose of learning about other approaches to considering and approaching the divine, but to build power and connections and communities among our various communities. Invite people from those different communities to your potlucks. The challenge at the moment is to diversify our social movements and our communities so that we're not just with each other all the time. Between informing ourselves, reaching out, and then taking action, and I'll just give you two principles here and then I'll shut up so we can do some questions and answers and hear from you all. The two most important things with respect to organizing are the first, to be aware of global and national issues, but to look for local opportunities. Power is not built in DC. Power comes home to roost in DC. Power is built everywhere else. I live in DC. I can't even vote, right? There's no power in DC. The power is everywhere else. Your city councils, your state legislatures hold immense influence. Again, if we look at the right wing, and the course that it took to dominate our nation's policy sphere, it leads through the states. What did Arizona and Alabama do? They legislated into effect state programs that were more aggressive than the federal regime. You can do the same thing going in the other direction. You can institute local laws that say our state police are not going to spy on people if they haven't done anything wrong. You can legislate local laws that say we're not going to share our arrest data with the federal biometric database. You can legislate state laws that say we're going to track the race of people who are stopped and searched by the police so that we end discrimination. These are things you can do at the state level. You can't do it in DC, not today anyway, and I doubt anytime soon. But if enough of you do it in the states, things here will start to shift. So looking down, right? Being aware of the issues around, but looking for local opportunities is critical. The other part I want to leave you with here is to be proactive. We were talking before about actively availing yourself of information. As an organizer, it's the same principle of proactivity applied to a different sphere. So if on the one hand we're saying be proactive about gaining information, also be proactive about creating advocacy opportunities. What does that look like? I'll give you a case study. In Berkeley, California, you might think of it as a very liberal place and it has that reputation from another point in time. Berkeley is not a particularly progressive place. You know, all of the people from the Vietnam era that were active there pretty much got gentrified north. It's a very well-resourced, affluent suburb of San Francisco. About a year and a half ago, starting with the city's Peace and Justice Commission, the group I run, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, we started pulling together the different communities. The Latino community, the East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, the the Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, African American communities through the NAACP, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, through communities, organizations representing our communities, the Asian Law Caucus, the Council for American Islamic Relations. There's a Shia professor at UC Berkeley. We pulled these different folks together, student groups, peace and justice networks. There's a veterans group in Berkeley. All of those groups for the last year and a half have been meeting roughly every month, sometimes 2 weeks, to plot events like the one I spoke at a Unitarian Universalist church last October that was covered by the local media, including Univision and the Latino community, and started to shift the debate. Several members of their city council became aware of these issues. They just had a hearing last week. They've been all over the press in the Bay Area talking about each of these different issues: racial profiling and the war on drugs, the suppression of dissent using police departments, intelligence collection and reporting by their local police department, and they're on the cusp of winning the nation's most aggressive law with respect to protecting civil rights for everyone. When we all stand together to defend the rights of everyone, that's when we win. The only way to get there is in the States. The only way to get there is locally. The only way to get there is through potlucks. The only way to get there is by asking people about their kids and what inspires them and where they came from. The only way to get there is through personal relationships with individuals in other communities. And as bad as the crisis that we confront today is, I do take a great deal of inspiration from the Korematsu era and remembering that it can and has been much worse. We can win this struggle if we try to win it together. And I'm very enthused and excited to see you all here today. Thanks.